Imagine a tower. Not one of shining white marble, reaching for the heavens in some grand aspiration. No, this one squats, a Gothic monstrosity of gray stone, its silhouette a jagged tear against the bruised twilight sky. It is a place forgotten, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. A place where the wind howls secrets into the cracks in the mortar, secrets that cling like cobwebs to the very soul. This isn't just any tower. This is Isolde's tower. For 40 years, she has been its prisoner. 40 years of sunrises unseen, of laughter unheard, of life unlived. 40 years locked away with only the echoing whispers of her own mind for company. But before we delve into the labyrinth of her confinement, before we examine the slow, agonizing descent into what some might call madness, we must understand the legend of Isolde and the events that led her to this desolate precipice. Isolde wasn't born for a tower. She was a blossom sprung from royal blood, a princess whose name was once synonymous with grace and intelligence. Tales speak of her sharp wit, her uncanny ability to read people, her relentless pursuit of knowledge. They say she possessed a beauty that could make poets weep and a spirit that refused to be caged. But beauty and spirit, it seems, are dangerous commodities in a world ruled by ambition and fear. The chronicles paint a picture of a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. Political intrigues, simmering resentments, and the ever-present threat of war cast a long shadow over the royal court. Isolde's father, the king, was a man worn thin by the weight of his crown, a man desperate to secure his legacy. He saw in Isolde a valuable pawn, a piece to be strategically placed on the board of dynastic power. A marriage was arranged. A union, designed to solidify alliances, to quell dissent, to bring stability to a fractured realm. But Isolde, the fiery, independent Isolde, refused to play her part. She saw through the gilded cage, recognized the charade for what it was, a loveless pact built on political expediency. And she dared to defy it. Some say she fell in love with a commoner, a stable boy whose hands were rough but whose heart was true. Others whisper of a forbidden knowledge she unearthed, secrets that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the kingdom. Still others claim she simply possessed too much power, too much influence for a woman in a world that demanded obedience. The truth, as it often does, likely lies somewhere in the tangled web of these competing narratives. Whatever the catalyst, Isolde's defiance ignited a firestorm. Her refusal to conform, her challenge to the established order, was deemed an act of treason, an unforgivable transgression. And so, the sentence was passed. Isolde would be confined to the ancient tower, a forgotten relic on the fringes of the kingdom, until her spirit was broken, her will subdued. Or, as some whispered in hushed tones, until she simply ceased to be. The tower, you see, wasn't just a prison, it was a tomb. A place where memories faded, where hope withered, where the very essence of a person could be slowly, deliberately extinguished. It was a statement, a warning to anyone who dared to question the authority of the crown. It was a place designed to erase Isolde, to scrub her from the pages of history as if she had never existed. And for a time, it seemed to be working. The world outside the tower walls moved on, oblivious to the princess languishing within. New alliances were forged, new battles were fought, new songs were sung. Isolde became a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, a ghost haunting the corridors of a forgotten past. But whispers, as we know, can carry. Legends can endure. And even in the darkest of dungeons, even in the most isolated of towers, the human spirit, however fractured, can find a way to survive, to resist, to endure. The tower's shadow, however, extends far beyond the stone walls that contain Isolde. It casts a long, chilling pall over the entire kingdom, a constant reminder of the price of dissent, the cost of freedom. It is a symbol of oppression, of control, of the insidious ways in which power can be used to silence those who dare to speak truth to it. And so we return to the tower. To Isolde, to the woman who has become a legend in her own right. Is she broken? Has she succumbed to the madness that surely festers within those cold, damp walls? Or does a flicker of rebellion still burn within her heart? Does a spark of hope remain, waiting for the chance to ignite and set the world ablaze? These are the questions we will explore. These are the mysteries we will unravel. Because the story of Isolde is not just a tale of imprisonment. It is a story of resilience, of defiance, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most insurmountable of odds. It's a story that deserves to be told, and a story that, perhaps, holds a mirror up to our own world, forcing us to confront the darkness that lurks within ourselves and within the systems that govern our lives. So brace yourself. The tower's shadow is about to envelop us all. Imagine being confined to a single room, day after day, year after year. The only view, a sliver of sky framed by cold, unyielding stone. This was Isolde's reality. A reality constructed not of her own choosing, but one imposed upon her. To understand the legend of Isolde, the madwoman of the tower, we must first descend into the abyss of her early confinement. To witness the genesis of her isolation, initially, the tower room was adequate. A large bed draped with heavy tapestries, a small hearth that sputtered inconsistently, a sturdy wooden table and chair, luxuries perhaps for a prisoner. But these were merely trappings, hollow gestures designed to mask the brutal truth. Isolde was not a guest. She was an inmate. The first few months were marked by a desperate, almost frantic hope. She would rush to the window at the first sign of a rider, straining her eyes to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. Letters were written, filled with pleas and questions only to be confiscated, unread, by her taciturn guards. Meals were delivered 3 times a day, bland, tasteless gruel and stale bread. Human interaction was limited to curt instructions and the clanging of the lock. This carefully constructed monotony served a purpose: to erode Isolde's spirit. To break her will. Sleep offered little respite. The nightmares began subtly, whispers in the darkness, phantom footsteps on the stairs. They echoed the accusations that led to her imprisonment. Lies, Isolde insisted, fabricated by enemies seeking to usurp her family's power. But with each passing night, the nightmares grew more vivid, more real. Doubts, like insidious vines, began to creep into her consciousness. Was she truly innocent? Or was there a darkness lurking within her, a seed of madness waiting to bloom? The silence was perhaps the most insidious torment. A thick, suffocating silence that pressed in on all sides, amplifying every creak of the tower, every rustle of the wind. It was a silence that bred paranoia, that twisted thoughts into grotesque shapes. Isolde would spend hours talking to herself, reciting poems, singing old ballads. Anything to break the oppressive quiet, to reassure herself that she still existed, that she hadn't simply vanished into the void. The guards, emotionless automatons in service to an unknown master, were instructed to never engage. They would deliver meals, empty the chamber pot, and perform the bare minimum of their duties without uttering a single word. Their silence was a weapon, a constant reminder of Isolde's utter powerlessness. She tried everything to elicit a reaction: insults, pleas, even feigned madness. But they remained impassive, their faces blank slates reflecting her own desperation. Slowly, imperceptibly, the hope began to fade. The letters ceased. The frantic rushes to the window became less frequent. Isolde began to spend her days staring blankly at the stone walls, her mind adrift in a sea of fragmented memories and half-formed thoughts. She stopped bathing, stopped combing her hair. Her once vibrant clothes became stained and rumpled. The vibrant, intelligent young woman who had been imprisoned in the tower was slowly being replaced by a hollow shell. The turning point, many believe, was the death of her pet raven, Corvus. a gift from her brother before the incident. Corvus had been her only companion, her only confidant. She would spend hours talking to him, sharing her fears and her hopes. One morning, she found him lying dead in his cage, his black feathers ruffled, his eyes glazed over. No sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. Just death. Isolde buried Corvus in a small patch of dirt outside the window. She had to use her bare hands, the guards refusing to provide her with a shovel. As she scooped out the earth, her fingers bleeding, she felt something snap within her. The last vestiges of hope, of reason, seemed to drain away with the falling soil. From that day forward, Isolde's behavior became erratic. She began to speak in riddles, to laugh at inappropriate moments. She would spend hours staring at the walls, tracing patterns with her fingers, claiming to see faces and figures in the stone. The whispers in the darkness intensified, morphing into voices, mocking her, tormenting her. She started tearing strips of fabric from her dress and weaving them into intricate patterns on the floor, claiming they were maps to hidden passages, keys to unlocking her freedom. The guards, sensing a shift in her mental state, became even more vigilant. They reported her increasingly bizarre behavior to their superiors, who in turn ordered them to tighten their security. The tower, already a prison, became a tomb. The descent into madness was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, agonizing slide. Each day brought new torments, new delusions. The isolation, the silence, the constant fear had chipped away at Isolde's sanity, leaving her vulnerable to the whispers of the darkness. She began to lose track of time. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons changed, but within the tower walls, it was always the same cold stone, the same bland meals, the same suffocating silence. She started forgetting things, her name, her past, even the faces of her loved ones. The tower became her entire world, her entire reality. And within that world, madness reigned supreme. This wasn't simply imprisonment. It was psychological warfare. Isolde wasn't just being kept from the world. The world was being systematically erased from her mind. The isolation was a crucible, forging a new Isolde, one twisted and broken by despair. The stage was now set for the unfolding legend of the madwoman in the tower. But what horrors would manifest within those stone walls? And would Isolde ever truly escape the clutches of her own unraveling mind? We are only now beginning to understand. The rituals of control weren't just about keeping Isolde physically confined. They were about systematically dismantling her mind, her spirit, her very sense of self. Imagine a cage, not built of stone and iron alone, but woven from routine, repetition, and the slow, agonizing drip of utter isolation. Each day began before dawn, not with the gentle light of sunrise, but with the harsh, intrusive glare of a single torch carried by the jailer. He was a man of few words, his face etched with the same weariness and resignation that seemed to permeate the very stones of the tower. He never spoke to Isolde, only grunted to signify the start of the day. This was deliberate. Language was a connection, a potential seed of rebellion. Silence was the ultimate weapon. The first ritual was the inspection. The jailer would circle the room, his eyes sweeping over Isolde's meager possessions. A chipped wooden bowl, a threadbare blanket, a small, worn book, items deemed safe, incapable of aiding an escape or fostering dangerous thoughts. Anything new, anything slightly out of place, was immediately confiscated and destroyed. It wasn't about security. It was about reminding her that she owned nothing, controlled nothing. Then came the cleaning. Isolde was given a bucket of cold water and a rough cloth. She was expected to scrub the stone floor, the walls, every inch of her prison cell. This wasn't about hygiene. The tower was perpetually damp and cold. It was about humiliation, about forcing her to perform menial tasks, to degrade herself. It was a constant reminder of her fallen status, the chasm between the life she once knew and the squalor of her present existence. Food followed, a meager gruel served in the same chipped bowl. The jailer would simply shove it through the bars of the door, never making eye contact. The gruel was bland, tasteless, barely enough to sustain life. It was sustenance, not nourishment. Just enough to keep her alive, a prisoner in her own failing body. Variety was forbidden. It was another form of control, depriving her of even the smallest pleasures, the simplest joys. After food came the silence. Hours of unbroken, crushing silence. No visitors, no letters, no news from the outside world. Isolde was utterly cut off, adrift in a sea of her own thoughts. This was perhaps the most insidious form of torture. The mind, deprived of external stimuli, begins to turn inward, to feed on itself. Memories become distorted, reality becomes blurred, and the line between sanity and madness begins to fray. To combat the silence, Isolde developed her own rituals. She would trace patterns on the stone floor with her finger, counting the cracks, the imperfections. She would whisper stories to herself, tales from her past, fragments of forgotten poems. She clung to these fragments, these remnants of her former life, as if they were lifelines in a raging storm. But even these small acts of defiance were carefully monitored. The jailer would occasionally appear at the door, his eyes cold and unreadable. His presence was a constant reminder that she was never truly alone, never truly free to escape into her own mind. Once a week, a physician would visit. He was a pale, scholarly man, more interested in the workings of the mind than the well-being of the body. He would ask Isolde questions, probing, intrusive questions designed to assess her mental state. Were her thoughts clear? Did she experience visions? Did she hear voices? He treated her not as a person, but as a specimen, an object of scientific curiosity. His treatments were often cruel and ineffective. He prescribed bitter potions, laced with herbs and chemicals that left her weak and nauseous. He subjected her to bloodletting, claiming it would cleanse the humors and restore balance to her mind. But these treatments only served to further weaken her, to erode her physical and mental strength. It was a twisted form of science, a way of justifying her imprisonment, of proving that she was indeed mad, in need of constant supervision and control. Exercise was forbidden. Isolde was confined to her cell, denied the opportunity to stretch her limbs, to feel the sun on her skin. Her body grew weak and atrophied, a physical manifestation of her imprisoned spirit. The lack of sunlight caused her skin to become pale and translucent, her eyes sunken and shadowed. She was slowly fading away, becoming a ghost in her own life. The only variation in her routine came in the form of religious instruction. A priest would visit once a month to read passages from the scriptures and to offer prayers for her soul. But his words offered no comfort, no solace. He spoke of sin and redemption, of divine justice and the importance of obedience. He seemed to view Isolde as a cautionary tale, a living example of the consequences of disobedience and pride. His visits only served to reinforce her feelings of guilt and shame, to further isolate her from the world and from God. As night fell, the routine reversed. The jailer would return, this time with a single lamp, casting long distorted shadows on the walls of her cell. He would retrieve the chipped bowl and leave her to her thoughts, her dreams, her nightmares. Sleep offered little respite. Her dreams were filled with images of her past, of her lost freedom, of the faces of those she had loved and lost. She would wake up screaming, her body drenched in sweat, only to be met with the cold, unyielding silence of her prison. This was Isolde's life, day after day, week after week, year after year. A relentless cycle of control, designed to break her spirit, to erase her identity, to turn her into a docile, obedient prisoner. The rituals were the bars of her cage, the chains that bound her to her fate. They were the instruments of her slow, agonizing descent into madness. But even in the face of such systematic cruelty, a flicker of resistance remained. A tiny spark of defiance waiting for its chance to ignite. A whisper of hope carried on the wind, promising a day when the tower would fall and Isolde would finally be free. They say that even the tallest tower casts a shadow. And within Isolde's sunless prison, tiny cracks began to appear in the facade of despair, whispering of a spirit far from broken. For years, her captors had mistaken her silence for submission. They saw only a vacant gaze, a listless figure, resigned to her fate. But beneath that carefully constructed mask of madness, a plan was brewing. A desperate, audacious plan fueled by the embers of her former life. Remember, this wasn't a sudden rebellion. It was a slow, deliberate process. Isolde understood that any open defiance would be met with swift and brutal suppression. Her resistance had to be subtle, almost invisible, like a vine slowly but surely weakening the very stone it clings to. First sign, barely perceptible, was a change in her routine. She started asking questions, seemingly innocuous inquiries about the weather, the seasons, the names of the guards. Questions she knew they wouldn't answer truthfully, of course. But the act of asking was a probe, a testing of the waters, a signal to herself that she was still capable of engaging with the world, no matter how limited that engagement might be. Then came the dreams. Or rather, the feigned dreams. Night after night, she would thrash and moan in her sleep, muttering fragments of sentences that spoke of far-off lands, forgotten faces, and political intrigues. Just enough to pique the interest of her ever-present watchers, to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. Was she truly mad, or was something else at play? Were these simply the ramblings of a fractured mind, or were they echoes of a past they wanted desperately to bury? But perhaps the most daring act of resistance was her attempts at communication. The tower, you see, wasn't entirely isolated. The wind carried sounds from the nearby village. The occasional bird would perch on the windowsill, and most importantly, supplies were delivered regularly. This was Isolde's lifeline. Initially, she tried to leave messages within the food baskets. Scratched symbols into the bottom of a loaf of bread, carefully arranged herbs to form rudimentary letters, even using her own blood to stain a white cloth with a plea for help. These attempts were clumsy, easily discovered, and predictably punished, but they served a purpose. They were a demonstration, to both herself and perhaps to some unknown observer, that she refused to be silenced. As the seasons turned, Isolde grew more cunning. She began observing the guards, studying their habits, their weaknesses. She learned their routines, the times they were most attentive, the times they were most distracted. And she discovered a chink in their armor: boredom. Guards were, for the most part, simple men, uneducated, unquestioning, and profoundly bored by their monotonous duty. They craved entertainment, a distraction from the endless hours of staring at a woman they believed to be insane. Isolde saw her opportunity. She started telling stories. At first, they were simple tales, rambling accounts of fantastical creatures and imaginary kingdoms, the kind of harmless nonsense one might expect from a madwoman. But slowly, subtly, she began weaving in elements of her real life. Factual details about the region, snippets of historical events, veiled criticisms of the ruling regime. She presented these stories as hallucinations, as fragments of a broken memory, but she knew that the guards were listening. They may not have understood the full significance of what she was saying, but they were being exposed to it, bit by bit. It was a form of psychological infiltration, a slow and insidious form of rebellion that bypassed their conscious defenses. Stories became more elaborate, more compelling. Isolde drew upon her knowledge of history, literature, and philosophy. transforming her madness into a captivating performance. She became the Scheherazade of the tower, holding her audience captive. With her words, slowly but surely undermining their loyalty and eroding their belief in the official narrative. And then came the birds. It started with a single sparrow that would occasionally flutter near her window. Isolde, with infinite patience, began feeding it crumbs of bread. Slowly, she gained its trust. Soon, other birds joined the sparrow, forming a small flock that would visit her window every day. Isolde realized that these birds could be her messengers. She began tying tiny scraps of cloth to their legs, bearing simple messages, symbols, letters, cryptic phrases, hoping that someone, somewhere would understand. Most of these messages were lost, of course, carried away by the wind or devoured by predators. But some, perhaps, reached their intended destination. Imagine the scene. A farmer tending his fields spots a small bird with a strange cloth tied to its leg. He catches the bird, examines the cloth, and finds a single crudely drawn symbol. A symbol that stirs a memory, a connection to a past he thought long forgotten. Or perhaps a merchant traveling through the region notices a bird behaving strangely. He sees the cloth, recognizes the handwriting, and realizes that something terrible is happening within the tower. These were long shots, desperate gambles. But Isolde understood that even the smallest chance of success was worth the risk. Because in the darkness of her prison, she had discovered a fundamental truth, that even the most powerful tower can be brought down, one stone at a time. And that the human spirit, when fueled by hope and driven by a thirst for freedom, can find a way to overcome even the most insurmountable odds. The whispers had begun, and soon they would become a roar. Isolde. The name even now tastes like ash on the tongue. But before the tower, before the madness, there was a girl. A princess, yes, but a girl nonetheless. Picture her, if you will, galloping across emerald fields, hair the color of spun moonlight streaming behind her. Not the vacant stare and tangled mane of the tower's prisoner, but a radiant, vibrant spirit. She favored riding astride, scandalous for a woman of her station. But Isolde always possessed a rebellious streak, a refusal to be confined by expectations. She loved the hunt, not for the kill, but for the thrill of the chase, the wind screaming in her ears, the raw power of her steed beneath her. Imagine her laughter echoing through the ancient forests, a sound now lost to the stone walls of her prison. Those forests, they held a significance far deeper than simple recreation. They were where she first learned the old ways, the whispers of the earth, the language of the birds. From a wizened old woman, ostracized from the court, deemed a superstitious crone, Isolde learned the secrets her father, the king, would have gladly burned from the kingdom. She was taught the power of herbs, the healing touch, and the ancient prophecies that foretold a darkness creeping across the land. Prophecies that spoke of a king's betrayal and a princess's fall. But Isolde was not just a wild spirit and a student of forbidden lore. She was also a scholar, devouring the ancient texts in the royal library, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. She had a keen intellect, a thirst for understanding that went far beyond the superficial education deemed suitable for a woman of her time. She questioned everything, challenged every dogma, and refused to blindly accept the pronouncements of priests and politicians. It was this very inquisitiveness, this unyielding pursuit of truth, that would ultimately seal her fate. And then there was Gareth. Sir Gareth, the king's most trusted knight, the embodiment of chivalry and honor. He was Isolde's childhood companion, her confidant, and inevitably, the object of her affection. Theirs was a love born of shared adventures, whispered secrets under starry skies, and a mutual yearning for something more than the rigid confines of courtly life. He saw in her not just a princess, but a brilliant, compassionate woman, destined for greatness. She saw in him not just a knight, but a man of unwavering integrity, a beacon of hope in a world of shadows. Their love blossomed in secret, stolen moments in hidden gardens, clandestine meetings beneath the cover of darkness. They knew their union was forbidden, that a princess could not simply marry a knight, no matter how noble. But they were young, reckless, and convinced that their love could conquer all. They dreamt of a future where they could be together, free from the constraints of their birth. A future where Isolde could rule alongside Gareth, a queen guided by wisdom and a king by honor. But dreams, as we know, are fragile things, easily shattered by the harsh realities of the world. The king, Isolde's father, had other plans. A marriage, alliance with a neighboring kingdom, a union that would secure his power and expand his territories. Isolde was merely a pawn in his political game, a bargaining chip to be traded for land and influence. When he learned of Isolde's love for Gareth, his fury knew no bounds. He accused Gareth of treason, of attempting to usurp the throne, of seducing the princess with his low-born charms. Gareth was imprisoned, his honor stained, his future irrevocably ruined. Isolde pleaded with her father, begged him to spare Gareth's life, to understand the depth of their love. But the king was unmoved, his heart hardened by years of political maneuvering and ruthless ambition. He saw only the threat to his power, the defiance of his authority. He offered Isolde a choice: marry the king of the neighboring kingdom, secure the alliance, and save Gareth's life, or refuse and watch him be executed as a traitor. Isolde, torn between her love for Gareth and her duty to her kingdom, made her decision. She agreed to the marriage, sacrificing her own happiness to save the man she loved. But she made one condition: that Gareth be released and banished from the kingdom, never to return. The king, relieved that Isolde had finally yielded, readily agreed. He cared little for Gareth as long as he was gone, out of the picture. But Isolde knew that marriage was not the only thing she would have to surrender. The neighboring king was a cruel and ambitious man, rumored to practice dark arts and consort with sinister forces. Isolde knew that marriage to him would mean not only the loss of her freedom, but also the potential enslavement of her soul. She confided in Gareth, telling him of her fears, her desperation. Together, they devised a plan, a desperate gamble, to escape their fate. On the eve of her wedding, Isolde and Gareth met in secret, one last time. They performed an ancient ritual, a binding oath sworn under the light of the full moon. They vowed to remain true to each other, no matter what, to find a way to be together, even if it meant defying the gods themselves. It was a reckless, foolish act, fueled by desperation and the unwavering belief in their love. But their plan was discovered. The king, alerted by a treacherous servant, ambushed them in the forest. Gareth fought valiantly, but he was outnumbered, outmatched. He was captured once more, his fate sealed. Isolde, heartbroken and defeated, was dragged back to the castle, her dreams of freedom shattered. The king, enraged by her defiance, decided on a punishment far more cruel than death. He would not kill Isolde, but he would silence her, imprison her, erase her from history. He would lock her away in the tower, far from the eyes of the world, and let her madness consume her. The tower, you see, was not just a prison. It was a tomb for a life lived too loudly, a spirit that refused to be broken. Isolde, a name whispered in hushed tones, synonymous with madness and misfortune. But what if her madness was manufactured? What if the misfortune was a deliberate act of political maneuvering, orchestrated from the shadows? We've explored the tower's oppressive atmosphere, the rituals designed to break her spirit, and the fragmented glimpses into her past. Now let's peel back another layer of this twisted tapestry and confront the uncomfortable truth. Isolde's imprisonment wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a carefully calculated political strategy. Think about it. 40 years. 40 years of a young woman's life stolen, her potential extinguished, her very sanity eroded. Such an undertaking requires resources, manpower, and most importantly, a motive. And motives, in the world of kings and queens, are rarely simple. They are tangled webs of power, ambition, and the ruthless pursuit of stability. Stability often built on the backs of the silenced. The official narrative, of course, paints Isolde as a tragic figure, a victim of her own fractured mind. Convenient explanation that absolves those who hold the keys to her cage. But look closer. Who benefits from Isolde's seclusion? Who stands to gain from her silence? Let's start with the obvious, the crown. In Isolde's time, royal families were not simply figureheads. They were active players in the Game of Thrones, their bloodlines and alliances dictating the flow of power. And Isolde, before her confinement, was not just any member of the royal family. She was a direct heir, potentially a queen in her own right, a queen, moreover, known for her unconventional views. Views that challenged the established order, views that threatened the status quo. Imagine the whispers in the royal court. Isolde is too independent. Isolde is too outspoken. Isolde questions the divine right of kings. These whispers, like insidious poison, would have slowly eroded her support, creating an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion. Suddenly, her intelligence becomes a liability, her compassion a weakness, her very existence a threat. Then, a convenient breakdown. A descent into madness that conveniently removes her from the line of succession. A narrative carefully crafted and disseminated to ensure her removal is not perceived as a blatant power grab, but as a necessary act of compassion. We are protecting her, they would say. We are keeping her safe. Lies wrapped in the guise of concern, but the crown isn't the only beneficiary. Consider the powerful noble families vying for influence and control. Isolde's progressive ideas, her willingness to challenge tradition, likely made her enemies. Among the old guard, those who clung to their feudal privileges and saw any change as a threat to their own power. By removing Isolde, these families could consolidate their influence, ensuring that the next ruler would be more pliable. And what of the religious institutions? In an era where the church held immense political sway, Isolde's potential to question dogma and challenge the authority of the clergy would have been seen as a grave danger. Her silence ensures that the established religious order remains unchallenged, its doctrines unquestioned. The church, therefore, becomes complicit, either actively participating in her confinement or passively condoning it. The price of Isolde's silence is power. Power for the crown, power for the nobility, power for the church. A power built on the suppression of dissent, the manipulation of truth, and the systematic destruction of a human being. But the political motivations run even deeper. Isolde's imprisonment sends a chilling message to anyone who dares to challenge the established order, question authority, and you will suffer the same fate. Her tower becomes a symbol of oppression, a stark reminder of the consequences of dissent. It's a powerful tool of control, a way to maintain order through fear. Furthermore, Isolde may have possessed information, dangerous information, that threatened the stability of the realm. Perhaps she uncovered a conspiracy, a secret alliance, or a hidden truth about the royal family. Imprisoning her ensures that this information remains buried, protecting those who would be exposed by its revelation. Think about the cost of maintaining such a secret. The guards, the keepers, the doctors, all complicit in Isolde's imprisonment. They are paid to remain silent, to perpetuate the lie, to ensure that the truth remains hidden within the tower walls. They become cogs in a machine of oppression. Their own consciences sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. And what about the rumors? The whispers of dark magic, of forbidden knowledge, that surround Isolde's name. These rumors, whether true or false, serve a purpose. They further demonize her, making her seem less human, less deserving of sympathy. They justify her imprisonment in the eyes of the public, turning her into a monster that needs to be contained. But even monsters have stories. And Isolde's story, the truth behind her confinement, is a story of political manipulation, of ruthless ambition, and of the devastating consequences of silencing those who dare to speak truth to power. It's a story that challenges us to question the narratives we are told, to look beyond the surface, and to demand justice for those who have been silenced. Because in the end, the truth, like a seed buried deep within the earth, will always find a way to bloom. And when it does, the tower and the lies it represents will crumble. The tower was Isolde's prison, yes, but it was also the stage for a more subtle, more insidious drama, the slow erosion of her spirit, facilitated by those entrusted with her care. They were not monsters, not precisely. They were cogs in a machine, caught between duty and conscience, their loyalties fractured like shattered glass. First, there was Sister Agnes, a woman of the cloth, hardened by years of service in the abbey. She was initially charged with attending to Isolde's basic needs: food, clothing, the changing of linens. Simple tasks, one might think, but they became weapons of control. Agnes was a creature of habit, of rigid routine. Every action was performed with the same cold precision, the same averted gaze. She spoke to Isolde only when necessary, her voice a monotone drone devoid of warmth or empathy. Agnes wasn't cruel, not overtly. She followed her orders to the letter. But in her silence, in her detachment, she created a vacuum. A space where Isolde's fears and anxieties could fester, unchecked. It was a slow drip, a steady erosion of hope. Agnes believed she was protecting herself, maintaining a distance from the madwoman to preserve her own sanity. But in doing so, she became a jailer, her piety a shield against the humanity of the woman she served. Then came Captain Valeries, commander of the guard stationed at the tower. A seasoned soldier, scarred both in body and soul, he saw Isolde's imprisonment as a necessary evil. He believed the whispers of madness, the tales of her treachery. He was a pragmatist, a man of action, ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the human heart. His duty was clear, to ensure that Isolde remained within the tower walls, and he carried it out with unwavering resolve. Valerius conducted regular inspections of the tower, a silent, imposing figure patrolling the stone corridors. He would observe Isolde from a distance, his eyes cold and assessing, searching for any sign of rebellion, any indication of a threat. He saw her not as a woman, but as a dangerous element to be contained. Yet there were moments, fleeting glimpses. Behind the hardened exterior, where doubt flickered in his eyes, he would see her sketching in the margins of ancient texts, her brow furrowed in concentration. He would hear her singing softly to herself, a haunting melody that echoed through the tower. And in those moments, he would question the narrative he had been given, the easy explanation of madness and betrayal. But the doubt was quickly suppressed, buried beneath layers of duty and fear. He could not afford to question the authority that had placed him there, the power that kept Isolde confined. The most conflicted of all was Master Elias, the royal physician. He was tasked with monitoring Isolde's mental and physical health, a delicate dance between care and control. Elias was a scholar, a man of science, but he was also a servant of the crown. He believed in the power of medicine to heal, but he was also aware of its potential for manipulation. He would visit Isolde regularly, examining her with a detached professionalism, his questions precise and probing. He would listen to her ramblings, searching for patterns, for clues to her condition. He prescribed herbs and concoctions, some to soothe her agitation, others, whispered to him by his superiors, to dull her mind. Elias struggled with the ethical implications of his role. He saw glimpses of intelligence in Isolde's eyes, moments of lucidity that contradicted the label of madness. He suspected that her confinement, the isolation and sensory deprivation, were contributing to her deteriorating mental state. But he was bound by his oath, by his loyalty to the king. He could not openly challenge the narrative, could not risk his own position, his own life. So he walked a tightrope, offering what comfort he could within the confines of his duty. He brought her books, smuggled in scraps of parchment and charcoal. For her drawings, he engaged her in intellectual debates, carefully skirting the edges of forbidden topics. He became a reluctant accomplice, a complicit participant in a system he knew was unjust. Each of these individuals, in their own way, contributed to Isolde's imprisonment. Agnes with her cold detachment, Valeries with his unwavering resolve, Elias with his conflicted conscience. They were not monsters, but they were not heroes either. They were ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, their choices shaped by fear, duty, and the seductive allure of power. They were the guardians and jailers, the keepers of the tower, and the keepers of Isolde's madness. And in the end, they were as trapped as she was, bound by the chains of their own making. For 40 years, Isolde was a prisoner of stone. Walls became her world, routine, her reality. But even in the deepest darkness, embers of hope can flicker. And sometimes, the most dangerous knowledge is found not in dusty tomes, but hidden within the very walls that imprison you. We're about to delve into the shadows of that tower, uncovering secrets that could shatter everything you thought you knew about Isolde and her family. Prepare yourselves, because what we're about to reveal is a truth far more twisted than madness. Itself. The tower, it turns out, was more than just a prison. It was a vault. While meticulously cleaning, as we discussed in our previous chapter, scouring the same cold stones day after day, year after year, she eventually noticed discrepancies. A loose stone here, a slightly uneven plaster patch there. Details that, in her increasingly sharp and desperate mind, screamed of hidden spaces. Most would have considered this wishful thinking, the product of a mind unraveling under the weight of solitude. But Isolde was nothing if not persistent. Her sanity may have been fractured, but her intellect remained dangerously intact. Using whatever tools she could find, a loosened piece of metal from her bed frame, a sharpened shard of pottery, she began to probe. The first discovery was almost accidental. A small, almost imperceptible gap behind a tapestry depicting her family crest. Tugging, scraping, and with a burst of adrenaline that belied her years of confinement, she managed to dislodge a stone. Behind it, a narrow cavity, dust. Decades of it. And beneath the dust, a wooden box. Small, unassuming, but radiating a palpable sense of importance. It was locked, of course. But Isolde, driven by a curiosity that burned brighter than any fear, was undeterred. After days of painstaking work, using the same metal shard that had freed the stone, she managed to pick the lock. What she found inside would rewrite her understanding of everything. Not jewels, not gold, but documents. Yellowed with age, brittle to the touch, written in a spidery, elegant script. Letters, journals, official decrees, all meticulously preserved, hidden away from prying eyes. These weren't casual family correspondence. These were secrets buried deep, secrets that someone had desperately wanted to keep hidden. The first document she deciphered was a letter from her mother. Not the cold, distant woman Isolde remembered, but a woman filled with barely suppressed terror. It spoke of a conspiracy, a plot to usurp the throne, and of a secret bloodline that threatened to unravel the kingdom's very foundations. It hinted at a pact made with something ancient and malevolent in exchange for power. The details were vague, obscured by fear and veiled language, but the implication was clear. Her family's rise to power was built on a foundation of treachery and dark magic. Then came the journals. Entries from her grandfather, the king before. Her father, A man she had always been told was a wise and benevolent ruler. The journals painted a different picture. A picture of a man consumed by paranoia, obsessed with maintaining control, willing to do anything to secure his dynasty. He wrote of rituals, of sacrifices, of pacts made with entities beyond human comprehension. He detailed the construction of the tower itself, not as a refuge, but as a prison specifically designed to contain something. Or someone. Isolde began to understand. The tower wasn't just her prison. It had been built for someone else, and she became the victim of circumstance. Was it meant for her mother? Or some other family member who knew too much? It was starting to make sense why, even when she was a child, her family looked at her as if she was a monster. But the most damning piece of evidence was a royal decree, signed by her own father. It declared her persona non grata, stripped her of her title, and condemned her to perpetual confinement within the tower. The reason? It was chillingly simple, for the safety of the realm. But then, a handwritten addition scribbled at the bottom of the document betrayed the truth. She knows too much. Her blood remembers. Her blood remembers. What did that even mean? The more she read, the more she understood that her imprisonment wasn't about madness or political expediency. It was about suppressing a truth that could shatter the kingdom. It was about silencing a bloodline that carried a dangerous legacy. This forbidden knowledge was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave her a purpose, a reason to fight back. It transformed her from a victim into a seeker of truth. On the other hand, it plunged her deeper into despair. To realize that her own family, the people who should have loved and protected her, were the ones who had condemned her to this living hell. It was enough to break even the strongest spirit. But Isolde wasn't broken. She was forged. The secrets she uncovered within those hidden documents fueled her anger, sharpened her intellect, and ignited a burning desire for revenge. The tower may have been her prison, but it had also become her sanctuary, a place where she could unravel the lies, piece together the truth, and plot her escape. The world thought she was mad. They thought she was defeated. But they were wrong, so terribly wrong. Because Isolde, armed with the forbidden knowledge of her family's dark past, was about to unleash a storm that would shake the kingdom to its very core. And the world would soon learn that locking a woman in a tower for 40 years doesn't break her. It weaponizes her. The tower wasn't just a prison. It was a crucible of the mind. Imagine being confined to a single space, year after year, with nothing but your own thoughts for company. That's where Isolde found herself, and the consequences, predictably, were devastating. But it wasn't a simple descent into despair. Her mind, starved of external stimuli, began to generate its own reality, a labyrinth of hallucinations, altered memories, and alternative timelines. We need to understand that sensory deprivation is a form of torture. The brain craves input, and when it doesn't receive it, it starts to create its own. Think of phantom limb syndrome, but applied to the entire world. Isolde's brain, desperately seeking stimulation, conjured up sights, sounds, and even people that weren't there. These weren't just fleeting visions. They were fully formed, immersive experiences. Some were comforting, echoes of her past life, fragments of conversations with loved ones, replayed over and over again, slowly twisting and distorting with each repetition. Others were terrifying, grotesque parodies of her captors, whispering threats and accusations in the dead of night. Imagine the walls themselves beginning to speak, their stone surfaces morphing into faces, leering and judging. Imagine the shadows dancing in the corners of the room, taking on human forms, their movements mocking and menacing. This was Isolde's reality, a constant barrage of sensory overload manufactured entirely within her own mind. But it wasn't just about hallucinations. The isolation also profoundly impacted Isolde's perception of time. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, until time itself became meaningless. Memories blurred, the past and present merging into a single amorphous mass. She began to question her own identity, her own sanity. Was she really Isolde, the woman who had once lived a vibrant life outside the tower walls? Or was she just a figment of her own imagination, a character in a never-ending nightmare? This is where the formation of alternative realities begins. To cope with the relentless torment, Isolde's mind began to construct elaborate fantasies, alternate scenarios in which she was free, loved, and powerful. These weren't just daydreams. They were fully realized, internally consistent worlds, complete with their own histories, characters, and rules. In one, she was a warrior queen, leading armies against her oppressors. In another, she was a renowned scholar, unlocking the secrets of the universe. In yet another, she was simply a wife and mother, living a peaceful life in a sun-drenched village. These alternative realities provided Isolde with a refuge from the horrors of her confinement. They gave her a sense of control, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope, even if only within the confines of her own mind. But there was a dark side to these fantasies. The more real they became, the more difficult it was for Isolde to distinguish them from reality. The line between what was real and what was imagined became increasingly blurred, until it eventually disappeared altogether. She would often act out scenes from her alternative realities, talking to imaginary people, fighting imaginary battles, lost in a world of her own making. Her captors, of course, saw this as further proof of her madness, further justification for her imprisonment. But in reality, it was a survival mechanism, a desperate attempt to preserve her sanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. Let's think about the implications here. Isolde wasn't just going crazy. She was actively rewriting her own narrative, creating her own universe within the confines of her mind. This is a powerful, albeit tragic, testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it also raises profound questions about the nature of reality itself. What is real and what is not? Is reality simply a shared hallucination, a consensus, agreement about what we perceive to be true? And if so, what happens when that consensus breaks down, when individuals create their own independent realities? The discovery of hidden documents within the tower, as we will soon explore, further complicates this picture. Were these documents real, or were they just another figment of Isolde's imagination? Did they hold the key to her past, or were they just a reflection of her deepest fears and desires? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, in the shadowy borderland between reality and illusion, where Isolde spent so many years of her life. But consider, was she truly mad? Or was she simply responding to an insane situation in the only way she knew how, by constructing a world where she could still retain some semblance of control, some flicker of hope? The answer, I suspect, is far more complex and far more disturbing than we might initially assume. Isolde's shattered sanity wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength, a testament to the extraordinary power of the human mind to adapt, to survive, even in the most horrific of circumstances. But it was also a tragedy, a profound loss, a reminder of the devastating consequences of isolation, deprivation, and the relentless erosion of the self. And her story, etched in the annals of the tower, serves as a chilling warning about the fragility of the human mind and the enduring power of the human spirit. Isolde wasn't screaming into the void, she was listening. 40 years within these walls hadn't driven her mad, they'd made her meticulous. Every creak of the stone, every shift in the wind, every change in the guard's routine became a data point. And from those points, a plan began to coalesce. It wasn't a plan born of desperate hope, but of cold, calculating logic. Her first task wasn't escape itself, but reconnaissance. The tower was her prison, but also her world. And within that world, she wasn't entirely alone. There was Margaret, the elderly cook who brought her meals, a woman worn down by years of service, but whose eyes still held a flicker of empathy. And there was Thomas, the young stable boy who occasionally delivered firewood, a nervous lad prone to stuttering, but whose heart, Isolde sensed, was softer than the stone walls around him. These were her potential allies, her cracks in the foundation of her confinement. But approaching them directly would be foolish. Trust, especially in this environment, was a currency more valuable than gold. So Isolde began her subtle campaign. With Margaret, it was simple inquiries about the outside world, disguised as idle curiosity. "Tell me, Margaret," she'd ask as the woman ladled stew into her bowl, "what news do the market vendors bring these days? Is the harvest plentiful?" Each question, carefully crafted, was designed to gauge Margaret's awareness, her opinions, her loyalties. And slowly, Isolde began to glean information. Margaret grumbled about the Duke's exorbitant taxes, about the villagers struggling to feed their families. She spoke of whispers of rebellion brewing in nearby forests, of farmers secretly stockpiling weapons. It was a delicate dance, extracting information without raising suspicion. With Thomas, the approach was different. He was more easily intimidated, more likely to betray her out of fear. So Isolde focused on kindness, on small gestures of appreciation. A shared story from her youth, a gentle compliment about his work with the horses, a simple thank you that lingered in the air. She learned of his dreams of leaving the Duke's service, of owning a small farm, of finding a wife. Dreams that, she knew, were unlikely to be realized under the Duke's thumb. Then came the accident. A spilled bucket of water, strategically placed near a loose stone in the tower wall. "Oh dear, Thomas," she said, feigning distress. "Would you be so kind as to help me clean this up? I fear I might slip and fall." As Thomas mopped up the water, she casually pointed out the loose stone. "That looks rather precarious. Someone should fix that before it collapses." It was a test, a subtle suggestion, planted in fertile ground. She watched with an almost detached curiosity as Thomas hesitated, then tentatively tried to dislodge the stone further. It came loose with a satisfying thunk, revealing a small cavity behind it. Just large enough, Isolde calculated, to hide a small object. From that moment forward, the cavity became their secret meeting place, their clandestine communication hub. Isolde began leaving small notes for Thomas, wrapped tightly in scraps of cloth. Simple requests at first. "Bring me more candles if you can. The nights are long." Or, "Do you know if the Duke is expected to visit soon?" Then, the requests became bolder. "I need a piece of metal, anything small and sharp. A nail, a broken knife, anything. And most daringly, find me a map. A map of the tower and the surrounding grounds." The risks were immense. Discovery would mean not only the failure of her plan, but potentially fatal consequences for Thomas and Margaret. But Isolde knew that without their help, she was doomed to remain a prisoner. And the longer she waited, the weaker she became, the more fragile her carefully constructed sanity. Margaret, initially hesitant, eventually succumbed to Isolde's quiet persistence. Driven by a combination of pity and resentment towards the Duke, she began smuggling small items into the tower, a rusty hairpin, a piece of coarse rope, a handful of dried herbs. She also became Isolde's eyes and ears in the kitchen, gathering information about the guards' routines, their weaknesses, their potential for bribery. Thomas, emboldened by Isolde's trust and fueled by his own simmering discontent, proved to be surprisingly resourceful. He managed to acquire a crude map of the tower, painstakingly drawn from memory and scraps of parchment he'd found in the stables. He also procured a small, sharpened piece of metal, a broken horseshoe nail, honed to a fine point on a whetstone. With the map, the metal, and the information gleaned from Margaret, Isolde's plan began to take shape. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal. It relied on precise timing, unwavering courage, and a healthy dose of luck. But it was her only chance. She knew the tower's layout intimately. She knew the guards' shifts, their routines, their weaknesses. She knew that the west wall, overlooking the forest, was less heavily guarded than the main entrance. And she knew, thanks to Margaret, that the Duke was planning a hunting trip in the coming weeks, leaving the tower under the command of a notoriously lazy captain. The plan hinged on exploiting that window of opportunity. During the Duke's absence, Isolde would use the sharpened nail to pick the lock on her cell door. She would then make her way to the west wall, using the rope to descend to the forest floor. Margaret would leave a horse and supplies hidden near the edge of the woods, and Thomas, God willing, would create a diversion to distract the guards. It was a long shot, a gamble with impossibly high stakes. But Isolde had spent 40 years honing her mind, sharpening her will, and patiently waiting for her moment. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. Now it was time to reap the whirlwind. And she would. Or die trying. Isolde's gamble hung by a thread, a silken thread woven from stolen moments and whispered promises. For 40 years, the tower had been her world, its stone walls the boundaries of her existence. But stone, as she knew, could be worn away by water and resolve, by relentless planning. The escape, months in meticulous preparation, hinged on a single night, a moonless void where shadows danced like conspirators. The old servant, Ilara, a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by years of silent servitude, had proven to be Isolde's unlikely ally. Ilara, weary of the tower's suffocating atmosphere and fueled by a spark of rebellion long dormant, had smuggled in the tools, a slender file, painstakingly sharpened against the hearthstones, and lengths of rope, pilfered from the castle stores. Under the guise of mending tapestries, the plan was simple, brutal in its simplicity. Isolde would file through the bars of her window, a feat that took weeks of clandestine effort, each stroke masked by the rhythmic creaks of the aging tower. Under cover of darkness, she would then lower herself down the rope, a dizzying descent. To the unforgiving earth below. The night arrived cloaked in an oppressive stillness. Not even the wind dared to whisper. Isolde, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, worked with feverish intensity. The last bar, finely severed, clattered silently onto the stone floor, swallowed by the darkness. She pressed her face against the opening, a rush of cold night air filling her lungs, the first unmediated breath of freedom in decades. Lowering the rope, she tested its strength with trembling hands. It held. Taking a final look at the room that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, she stepped into the void. The descent was agonizing, each knot chafing against her skin, each creak of the rope a potential death knell. The ground seemed impossibly far away, a blurred tapestry of black and gray. Finally, her feet touched earth. She stumbled, catching herself on the rough bark of a nearby tree. For a moment, she simply stood there, the cool earth grounding her, the vast sky a dizzying expanse above. She was free, but freedom, she soon discovered, was not silence, the absence of Isolde's usual morning routine, the clatter of the breakfast tray, the soft murmur of her voice, even the distant echo of her laughter-tinged madness, was the first discordant note. Ilara, feigning illness, remained in her quarters, her guilt a knot in her stomach. The new guard, a brutish man named Gregor, indifferent to Isolde's plight and more concerned with the warmth of the fire than the state of his prisoner, was slow to notice the anomaly. It was only when he entered the chamber to find the window gaping open, the sawed bars glinting ominously in the dim light, that the alarm was finally raised. Gregor, his face contorted with panic, bellowed a warning that shattered the morning calm. The castle erupted in chaos. Guards, roused from their slumber, stumbled through the corridors, their armor clattering, their shouts echoing through the stone halls. The captain of the guard, a grizzled veteran named Marius, swore under his breath. He had been entrusted with Isolde's safekeeping for years, a task he had considered a tedious but necessary duty. Now his career, perhaps even his life, hung in the balance. "Search the grounds! Seal the gates! No one leaves the castle!" He roared, his voice cracking with urgency. The hunt began. Torches flickered in the darkness, casting long dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye. The guards, their faces grim, fanned out across the castle grounds, their swords drawn, their eyes scanning the undergrowth. Hounds were released, their baying echoing through the night, their noses eagerly sniffing for the scent of escape. Marius, his mind racing, knew the implications of Isolde's escape were far more significant than a simple breach of security. Isolde was not just a prisoner. She was a political pawn, a silenced voice whose words could unravel carefully constructed alliances and expose long-buried secrets. Her escape threatened the very foundations of the kingdom. He questioned Ilara, his voice dangerously low, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The old woman, trembling under his gaze, maintained her innocence, her voice a shaky whisper. Marius, unconvinced but lacking concrete evidence, was forced to release her, a gnawing sense of unease settling in his stomach as the search intensified. A growing sense of dread permeated the castle. The guards, their initial excitement giving way to apprehension, began to whisper amongst themselves. Isolde was more than just a madwoman locked in a tower. She was a legend, a figure of fear and fascination. Stories of her supposed powers, her unearthly beauty, and her capacity for vengeance had been whispered in the castle halls for generations. The realization that she was now free, perhaps plotting her revenge, sent shivers down their spines. The initial sweep of the castle grounds yielded nothing. Isolde had vanished, swallowed by the night. Marius, his frustration mounting, ordered a wider search, dispatching riders to scour the surrounding countryside, their orders clear: find Isolde, and bring her back, alive or dead. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, a chilling discovery was made. Near the edge of the forest, not far from the tower walls, the hounds picked up a scent. A faint trail of blood, barely visible in the morning light, led them deeper into the woods. And then they found it, a discarded length of rope, frayed and stained with crimson, dangling from a low-hanging branch. The rope, identical to the one used to secure Isolde's window, confirmed their worst fears. Isolde was not just free. She was injured, vulnerable, and alone in the wilderness. The chaos in the castle escalated. The guards, driven by a mixture of fear and duty, pressed deeper into the forest, their pursuit relentless. They knew that time was running out. The longer Isolde remained at large, the greater the risk of her being discovered, of her story being told, of the truth being revealed. The tower had fallen, and with it, the carefully constructed edifice of lies that had kept Isolde imprisoned for so long. The price of silence was about to be paid, and the world was about to learn the true cost of Isolde's madness. The dust settles, but the silence? That's shattered forever. Isolde steps out of the ravaged tower, not into freedom, but into a world she no longer recognizes, a world that believes her mad. 40 years, a lifetime spent in darkness, now confronted by the harsh glare of truth. Or what they think is the truth. They see a madwoman, wild-eyed and disheveled, escaped from her gilded cage. They whisper stories of her lunacy, tales, spun from rumor and fear, carefully cultivated by those who benefit from her silence. What they don't see is a woman forged in the fires of solitude, a woman whose mind is sharper than any blade, a woman with nothing left to lose. Her first challenge isn't to clear her name, it's to take her name back. Isolde, it's been used as a curse, a warning to disobedient children, a justification for whispered conspiracies. She will reclaim it, syllable by syllable, deed by deed. The initial reactions are predictable: fear, suspicion, outright hostility. Town criers announce her capture, bounty hunters eager to prove their loyalty to the crown, urged onward by promises of riches and status. But Isolde is no longer the naive girl imprisoned 4 decades prior. The tower, her prison, was also her crucible. She learned to observe, to anticipate, to survive. She knows their weaknesses, their prejudices, the fault lines that run through their carefully constructed society. Her appearance sends shockwaves. The royal court, accustomed to its polished lies and self-serving narratives, is thrown into chaos. How could Isolde, supposedly deranged beyond repair, possibly have escaped? Who aided her? What secrets might she reveal? The queen and her inner circle close ranks, attempting to discredit her with carefully orchestrated displays of concern. Poor Isolde, they cluck. Her mind has clearly been broken by her ordeal. But Isolde anticipated this. While confined, she discovered hidden passages and forgotten archives within the tower. Documents detailing the very plot that led to her imprisonment. Records of falsified evidence, coerced testimonies, and outright bribery. Proof of her uncle's ambition, the king's weakness, and the queen's complicity. She holds these truths close, releasing them strategically, like poisoned darts aimed at the heart of their lies. Her first act is a public appearance, not at the castle, but in the town square. She speaks with a voice that, while raspy from disuse, resonates with undeniable authority. She doesn't rant, she doesn't rave. She speaks plainly, methodically, presenting her evidence with chilling clarity. They say I am mad, she declares, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. They say I am delusional, a danger to myself and others. But ask yourselves who truly benefits from my madness? Who profits from my silence? She reveals the truth about her uncle's treachery, the fabricated accusations of treason, the secret alliance forged with a rival kingdom. The crowd is stunned. They had heard whispers, of course, but whispers are easily dismissed. Facing the woman herself, the living embodiment of their suppressed doubts, the whispers become a roar. The queen retaliates swiftly, branding Isolde a traitor, a madwoman spreading seditious lies. The royal guards are dispatched to silence her, to drag her back into the shadows. But the people are no longer so easily swayed. They remember Isolde before the tower, the kind and compassionate princess who cared for the poor and championed justice. Doubt has been planted. What follows is a desperate game of cat and mouse. Isolde evading capture while slowly, deliberately dismantling the edifice of lies that has kept her imprisoned for so long. She finds allies in unexpected places, a disgruntled scribe who secretly copied incriminating documents, a former guard burdened by guilt, a network of commoners who remember her kindness. She uses the printing press, a relatively new and powerful tool, to disseminate her story, bypassing the controlled narratives of the royal court. Pamphlets bearing her likeness and her testimony flood the kingdom, igniting a firestorm of debate. The queen orders their destruction, but the words are already out, spreading like wildfire through dry brush. The most damning evidence emerges during a staged confrontation, expertly orchestrated by Isolde and her growing network of supporters. She manages to corner the queen in the royal chapel, a setting rich with symbolism. Before a gathering of nobles and clergy, she presents irrefutable proof of the queen's involvement in the conspiracy, a series of coded letters revealing her secret correspondence with Isolde's treacherous uncle. The queen denies it, of course, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. But the evidence is overwhelming, the letters authenticated by handwriting experts loyal to neither the crown nor Isolde. The scales begin to tip. Doubt turns to suspicion, suspicion to outrage. The king, a weak and indecisive man, finally cracks under the pressure. He orders an investigation, a public trial to determine the truth of Isolde's claims. The trial is a spectacle, A battle of wills between Isolde and the Queen, each fighting for their very survival. Isolde, armed with facts and fueled by righteous fury, presents her case with devastating precision. She exposes the lies, the manipulations, the betrayals that led to her imprisonment. Witnesses are called, their testimonies corroborating her account, shattering the carefully constructed facade of the royal court. The Queen fights back with cunning and desperation, attempting to discredit Isolde, to paint her as a vengeful madwoman, seeking to destroy the monarchy. But her efforts are ultimately futile. The evidence is too strong, the truth too undeniable. In the end, the Queen is found guilty of treason, her co-conspirators exposed and punished. Isolde is exonerated, her name cleared, her reputation restored. She walks free, not as a prisoner, but as a victor, a symbol of truth and justice. The tower, once her prison, now stands as a monument to her resilience, a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. But her fight wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that no other would be silenced, imprisoned, and forgotten. It was about creating a world where secrets could no longer fester in the shadows, but exposed to the harsh light of truth. Isolde's tower crumbled, yes, but the echoes of her confinement reverberate far beyond those fallen stones. What remains isn't just a tale of imprisonment, but a brutal testament to the insidious nature of unchecked power and the enduring human spirit's fight for liberation. Her story, if we truly listen, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own societies, about the very foundations upon which we build our concepts of justice, privacy, and remembrance. Think for a moment about the nature of justice. We often envision it as an impartial arbiter, blindfolded and wielding scales. But Isolde's fate rips that comforting illusion away, revealing the ugly reality of justice as a tool, wielded by those in power to silence dissent, maintain control, and erase uncomfortable truths. Her imprisonment wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about political expediency. It was about silencing a voice that threatened the established order, a voice that knew too much. How many Isoldes are there today, hidden in plain sight, their voices muted by systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable? We may not see physical towers, but what about the digital ones? The echo chambers of online censorship, the social prisons of cancel culture, the legal labyrinths that disproportionately impact marginalized communities? Isolde's legacy is a chilling reminder that justice, when divorced from compassion and accountability, becomes a weapon of oppression. Consider the concept of privacy. In our hyper-connected world, privacy feels like a quaint relic of a bygone era. We willingly surrender our personal data to corporations, governments, and social media platforms, often without fully understanding the implications. But Isolde's story serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked surveillance and the erosion of personal autonomy. She was denied privacy in its most fundamental form, the freedom to think, to feel, to exist without constant scrutiny and control. Her every action was monitored, her every thought potentially twisted and weaponized against her. Are we so different today? The algorithms that track our online behavior, the facial recognition technology that monitors our movements, the pervasive surveillance systems that permeate our cities, these are all modern-day towers, invisible, but no less oppressive. Isolde's plight compels us to ask, what price are we willing to pay for convenience and security? What freedoms are we sacrificing on the altar of technological progress? And what happens when the very tools designed to connect us become instruments of control? Then there's the question of remembrance. History, as they say, is written by the victors. And Isolde's story, for decades, was deliberately erased, distorted, and buried beneath layers of propaganda and lies. Her very existence was a threat to the narrative of those who imprisoned her. They sought to rewrite her story, to paint her as mad, dangerous, and deserving of her fate. How often does this happen? How often are the voices of the marginalized, the oppressed, the inconvenient, deliberately silenced, and their stories rewritten to suit the agendas of the powerful? Think about the forgotten histories of indigenous populations, the suppressed narratives of marginalized communities, deliberately distorted accounts of historical events. Isolde's legacy demands that we become active participants in the act of remembrance, that we challenge dominant narratives, seek out alternative perspectives, and ensure that the stories of the silenced are finally heard. It is our responsibility to ensure that Isolde's suffering, and the suffering of all those like her, is not in vain, but perhaps the most profound lesson Isolde's story offers lies in its exploration of the human capacity for resilience and resistance. Despite decades of isolation, manipulation, and psychological torment, Isolde refused to be broken. She clung to her memories, nurtured her inner strength, and ultimately found a way to reclaim her voice and expose the truth. Her rebellion wasn't just about escaping the tower. It was about defying the very system that sought to control her. It was about reclaiming her agency, her dignity, and her right to self-determination. This is the ultimate message of Isolde's legacy. Even in the darkest of times, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, the human spirit can endure, resist, and ultimately triumph. Her story is a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to challenge injustice, defend privacy, and ensure that the voices of the silenced are finally heard. The tower may have fallen, but the fight for freedom, for truth, for justice continues. And Isolde's whisper, once confined within stone walls, now echoes throughout eternity. It is up to us to listen. It is up to us to act. The madness wasn't hers. It was theirs. And now it's ours to confront.